3 feet. That's all it took to turn an ordinary suburban disagreement into the most expensive mistake my neighbor ever made. And every time I look out at the concrete survey markers sitting quietly along the edge of my yard, I still have to shake my head, because if someone had told me that a missing strip of grass would eventually cost a man his dream home, I would have laughed and said they'd been watching too many courtroom dramas. My name is Ethan Collins, and for almost 12 years I'd lived in the same little ranch-style house on Willow Creek Lane, the kind of neighborhood where kids still rode bikes after dinner and people waved from their driveways without expecting anything in return. My home wasn't fancy, never tried to be, but it carried something more valuable than polished marble countertops or imported stone patios. It carried memories. My late Aunt Helen left me the house after she passed away. She had spent nearly 30 years working for the county engineering department before retiring, and she always treated that property like it was part of the family. Every spring she'd kneel in the same flower bed beside the driveway, planting lilies with dirt under her fingernails and a smile on her face. After she was gone, I promised myself I'd keep that yard exactly the way she loved it. Then 6 months after my quiet life settled into its comfortable routine, a moving truck rolled into the house next door. That's when Victor Langford arrived. Victor was the kind of man who somehow managed to wear expensive sunglasses even on cloudy days. He worked in commercial real estate, drove a different luxury SUV every couple of years, and talked about property values the way other people talked about baseball scores. Within weeks, he'd replaced perfectly healthy trees with imported palms, installed security cameras that looked like they belonged outside a government building, ripped out the front lawn to replace it with decorative stone, and hired landscapers who showed up so often I started recognizing them by first name. Every conversation somehow circled back to how much he'd invested in the neighborhood. Rising property values help everybody, he'd say with that polished smile that never quite reached his eyes. I nodded, because arguing with people like Victor usually wasn't worth the energy. Still, I started noticing little things. Every Saturday morning, he'd walk around the side of our houses with his contractor, pointing at the narrow strip between our properties while holding rolled-up plans under his arm. They'd stop, measure, whisper something, then measure again. Once I joked over the fence, planning to build a runway over there. Victor laughed politely and answered, just maximizing potential. At the time, those words didn't mean much. Looking back now, they meant everything. One Thursday afternoon, I pulled into my driveway after work and immediately knew something was wrong. A construction trailer sat beside Victor's garage. Workers were unloading fence panels while another crew dug post holes straight through the edge of my flower bed. At first, I honestly thought they had made a mistake. I walked across the lawn and called out, "Hey, I think your guys are over the property line." One worker looked toward Victor instead of answering me. Victor slowly walked over with a coffee in one hand like he had all the time in the world. "Afternoon, Ethan," he said casually. "Beautiful day for improvements." I pointed toward the freshly dug holes. "Those improvements are in my yard." He smiled, took a folded document from under his arm, and handed it to me. "Actually, according to a new survey, they aren't." I looked down at the paperwork. It carried official-looking stamps, measurements, signatures, everything that made it appear legitimate. Victor crossed his arms and continued speaking in the calm voice of someone convinced he'd already won. "Turns out the original subdivision markers were inaccurate decades ago. My surveyor corrected the boundary. This 3-foot strip has always belonged to my lot." I stared at him. Then back at the ground where lilies my aunt had planted years earlier were being shoveled into a pile of dirt. "You're telling me my flowers have been growing on your property for 12 years. He shrugged. "Looks that way." Something about the way he said it lit a fire inside me. "You could have knocked on my door before sending excavators into my yard." Victor gave a short laugh. "Honestly, Ethan, I didn't think it had become such a big emotional issue. It's only 3 feet." I answered quietly, because anger rarely wins arguments. "Funny. People usually say it's only 3 feet when they're standing on someone else's land." His smile faded for just a second before coming back even wider. "If you disagree, you're welcome to hire an attorney." Then he turned around and told the workers to keep digging as if I wasn't standing there. That night, I barely slept. I called the county offices the next morning, but the clerk explained that because Victor had submitted a licensed survey, the records would need legal review before anyone could challenge it. An attorney I spoke with warned me boundary disputes could drag on for months, maybe years, and cost tens of thousands of dollars before reaching a courtroom. I sat alone on my back porch that evening staring at those unfinished fence posts cutting through what used to be my flower bed, wondering how someone could erase years of history with a few sheets of paper. And then, just as the sun disappeared behind the trees, I remembered something my Aunt Helen used to tell me every time she brought work home from the engineering office. Never throw away old maps, Ethan, because someday they'll remember things people don't. I suddenly realized her basement was still packed with boxes I'd never bothered to open, and for the first time since Victor's fence appeared, I felt something I hadn't felt all week: hope. The next morning I unlocked the basement door for what was probably the first time in years, and the smell hit me immediately: old paper, cedar shelves, and that faint scent every house seems to collect after decades of memories. My aunt had labeled everything with her neat handwriting: bridge inspections, utility projects, subdivision approvals, drainage revisions, and as I worked my way through dusty filing boxes, I started realizing just how much of this neighborhood had passed through her hands before any of us ever lived here. After nearly 3 hours, I found a long cardboard tube tucked behind an old drafting table. When I slid the rolled blueprint onto the floor and spread it open with a couple of paint cans, I just stared for a minute. Across the top were the words Willow Creek Estates Master Drainage Development Plan. I remembered hearing my aunt mention that project years ago, saying neighborhoods weren't built from the houses backward, they were built from the water outward. If you don't tell rain where to go, she'd always say, it'll choose for you. I grabbed a flashlight and looked closer. Every property line was there, every easement, every utility corridor, every drainage channel carefully marked in blue ink. Then I noticed something that made my heart start beating faster. Running directly between Victor's lot and mine wasn't just a property line. There was a protected stormwater easement almost 8 feet wide. The 3-foot strip Victor claimed wasn't ordinary land at all. It was part of a drainage corridor designed to carry runoff from nearly half the neighborhood during heavy storms. According to the notes, permanent structures were prohibited, fences required special approval, and any obstruction altering water flow violated county engineering standards. I leaned back against the basement wall and actually laughed. Not because I'd won anything yet, but because Victor had spent weeks trying to steal land that technically neither of us could legally build on. That wasn't even the biggest surprise. The more I studied the drawings, the more little notes started connecting with things I'd seen over the past 6 months. His oversized back deck, the expanded garage, the decorative retaining wall, even the stone landscaping he'd bragged about at the neighborhood barbecue. They all appeared dangerously close to the protected drainage zone. I spent the rest of Saturday walking around my backyard with a tape measure, comparing real-world distances to the engineering plans. Every measurement made my stomach sink a little more. Victor hadn't just nudged a fence across the line. His entire renovation project looked like it had been designed without any respect for the original subdivision restrictions. That afternoon, my next-door neighbor on the opposite side, an older retired teacher named Linda Harper, walked over carrying a plate of homemade cookies. She had watched the whole fence situation unfold from her kitchen window. "You look like you've either solved a murder," she joked, "or found buried treasure." I smiled for the first time all week. Maybe a little of both. I showed her the blueprint. She adjusted her glasses and quietly read the notes before looking toward Victor's backyard. "You know," she said slowly, "ever since he poured that new concrete patio, my backyard gets standing water every time it rains. Never happened before." That caught my attention immediately. "Seriously?" She nodded. "Thought it was just one of those things." We walked together around the edge of her yard. Sure enough, patches of dead grass and shallow depressions showed exactly where runoff had begun collecting. She even pulled out photos she'd taken after a spring storm, because she'd planned to complain about the soggy lawn to her landscaping company. The timestamps went back months. Suddenly, this wasn't just about my flowers or 3 feet of grass anymore. If Victor's improvements had changed drainage patterns, there might already be evidence of actual damage. Sunday became the busiest day I'd had in years. I photographed everything from every possible angle: fence posts, deck supports, garage foundation, concrete grating, retaining walls. I borrowed a laser level from my friend Mark, who owned a remodeling company, and we spent half the afternoon confirming that Victor's landscaping redirected runoff away from its original path. Mark didn't even know about the property dispute. When he looked over the measurements, he frowned. Whoever designed this either ignored drainage codes or figured nobody would ever check. By Sunday evening, my dining room looked like a detective's office. Maps covered the table. Photos were spread across the floor. My aunt's engineering plans sat beside current aerial images I'd downloaded from county records. I wasn't trying to build some revenge case. I simply wanted the truth organized well enough that nobody could dismiss it. Monday morning, instead of calling an attorney, I called 3 different offices. First, the county engineering department, then the regional flood management authority. Finally, environmental compliance. I never exaggerated. Never accused Victor of crimes. I simply said, I believe there may be construction occurring over a documented drainage easement, and I have original engineering records that might help. By 10:30 that morning, a county engineer named Melissa Grant called me back personally. Where did you get these plans? She asked after I emailed the scans. My aunt worked on the subdivision. There was a long pause before she answered. Mr. Collins, these appear to be original approval documents. Another pause. Can you meet us this afternoon? Around 1 o'clock, 2 county trucks pulled into the neighborhood. Then another SUV with the Flood Authority logo. I watched from my porch as inspectors stepped out carrying survey equipment instead of clipboards. Victor came outside wearing his usual confident grin. Can I help you folks? One of the inspectors introduced herself and asked to verify several property improvements. Victor barely looked concerned. Everything was professionally done. Melissa unfolded one of the original engineering drawings across the hood of her truck. We're just confirming compliance with existing easement restrictions. I could actually see the moment his confidence cracked. What easement? He asked. The lead inspector pointed toward the very fence line he'd spent all week defending. This protected drainage corridor. Victor laughed nervously. That survey says this land belongs to me. Melissa nodded. Ownership and easement rights aren't the same thing. His smile disappeared. They began taking measurements. Every few minutes another inspector called out numbers while someone compared them against the plans. Deck overhang, non-compliant. Garage extension, encroachment. Fence alignment, unauthorized installation inside the drainage easement. Retaining wall, altered runoff pattern. Then came the sentence that changed everything. One flood management engineer looked downhill toward Linda's property before turning back to his supervisor. This grading likely explains the recurring surface flooding complaints we've received this spring. Victor immediately interrupted. Nobody ever told me there were complaints. The engineer calmly replied. That doesn't change whether the drainage system was compromised. Victor pulled out his phone and called someone, probably his contractor. 20 minutes later, a man in a polo shirt hurried over carrying permit folders. They spread paperwork across the tailgate of a pickup truck while the inspectors reviewed each page one by one. I watched from across the yard as expressions slowly changed from curiosity to concern. Melissa eventually closed the last folder and looked directly at Victor. These permits authorized cosmetic improvements. They did not authorize construction within a protected drainage easement. Victor's contractor argued that the survey established a new property line. Melissa answered with a sentence I'll probably remember forever. Property boundaries can be disputed. Public easements cannot. The silence that followed felt heavier than any shouting match could have been. Workers who had been installing fence panels quietly stopped using their tools. Even the excavator operator climbed down from his machine to listen. Victor walked toward me across the grass, trying hard to keep his composure. You planned this. I looked him straight in the eye. No, you planned it. I just opened some old boxes. For the first time since we'd met, he had absolutely nothing clever to say. Behind him, inspectors began placing bright orange violation notices on the fence posts that had started this entire mess. And although none of us realized it yet, those little pieces of paper were only the beginning of a collapse that would end up costing far more than anyone on our street could have imagined. Over the next several weeks, our quiet little street turned into something that looked more like an active construction investigation than a suburban neighborhood. County vehicles came and went almost daily. Survey crews placed temporary markers across both properties. Engineers walked the drainage corridor with measuring rods, and every time another report came back, it seemed to uncover one more problem hidden beneath all of Victor's expensive upgrades. What began as an argument over 3 feet of land quickly became a complete review of every major project completed since he'd moved in. The county eventually issued its final determination, And when the certified envelope arrived at Victor's house, I could see him standing in his driveway reading page after page before lowering the papers and simply staring at his own backyard. The order was clear. The fence had to be removed immediately. The oversized deck would have to be demolished because a significant portion extended into the protected drainage easement. Part of the garage expansion also had to come down since its foundation interfered with required setback regulations established decades earlier. Even sections of the decorative retaining wall and concrete landscaping would need to be removed so stormwater could once again follow its original path. The estimated remediation costs were staggering, and because several improvements had been completed outside the scope of the permits that had actually been approved, his insurance company declined coverage. One afternoon, I happened to be watering the new flowers I'd planted where my aunt's lilies had once grown when Victor slowly walked across the property line. He looked different somehow. The confidence that used to fill every conversation had been replaced by exhaustion. After standing there quietly for a few seconds, he finally spoke. "Did you enjoy this?" I looked at him honestly before answering. "No." He frowned, almost surprised by my response. "You could have just taken me to court." I nodded. "I tried talking first. You told me to hire a lawyer." Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then I continued, "Victor, this was never about revenge. If you had knocked on my door that first day and said you'd made a mistake, we'd probably be laughing about all this over a backyard barbecue by now." He looked toward the orange survey flags still sticking out of the ground. "I trusted the wrong people." "Maybe," I replied quietly, "but you also stopped listening to the right ones." He gave a small nod before turning around and walking back toward his house. That was the last real conversation we ever had. Within 2 months, demolition crews returned, but this time they weren't building anything. They dismantled the beautiful cedar fence board by board, tore apart the oversized deck that had hosted summer parties only weeks before, removed sections of the expanded garage, and hauled away truckloads of concrete that had redirected water where it was never supposed to go. None of the neighbors celebrated. In fact, most of us watched in silence because there wasn't much satisfaction in seeing someone's dream unravel, even if they'd created the problem themselves. A few months later, a for sale sign appeared in Victor's front yard. Rumor around the neighborhood was that between legal fees, demolition costs, engineering work, restoration expenses, and the reduced market value of the property, the financial loss was enormous. Eventually, the house sold for considerably less than comparable homes nearby, largely because every future buyer now knew the property came with strict drainage restrictions that could never be ignored again. Not long after that, another county survey crew visited my yard one final time. They installed permanent concrete boundary monuments exactly where the original subdivision plans had intended decades earlier. One of the engineers smiled as he packed away his equipment and said, "These markers will probably outlive both of us." I looked down at those simple concrete posts and thought about my aunt. She had spent her career designing infrastructure most people would never notice, believing that the invisible parts of a community were often the ones holding everything together. Standing there, I realized she had been right about more than engineering. Integrity works the same way. Most days nobody notices it, until someone decides to ignore it. Every spring now I plant fresh lilies along that same edge of the yard. They grow exactly where my aunt used to kneel with her gardening gloves, and every time they bloom I remember that old sentence she repeated so many years ago. Never throw away old maps, because someday they'll remember things people don't. She wasn't just talking about blueprints. She was talking about history, responsibility, and the quiet truth that shortcuts almost always leave a trail behind them. Looking back, I don't think 3 feet of land destroyed Victor's future. Pride did. The fence was only the symptom. The real mistake happened the moment he convinced himself that money, confidence, and official-looking paperwork mattered more than honesty and a conversation between neighbors. Maybe some of you watching think I should have handled things differently. Maybe you believe I should have forgiven him, or maybe you think he got exactly what he deserved. That's the interesting part about stories like this. Reasonable people can come away with completely different opinions. So I'd really like to hear yours. If your neighbor crossed onto your property but claimed they had legal paperwork, what would you have done? Would you have fought back the same way? Or would you have tried one more time to settle things peacefully? Share your thoughts down in the comments because I read every one of them. And conversations like these remind us that sometimes the biggest battles in life don't start over money. they start over respect. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next true-style neighborhood conflict where patience, facts, and a little determination end up speaking louder than arrogance ever could.